Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel Think Big Learn Smart. After a long time I'm back with another topic, and today the topic of my discussion is a Cold War, a mega event of our 20th century that shaped our present and how the world looks right now. And let's move on to discuss about the following tenets of that topic. Let's start to discuss about its introduction, its history, what were the causes of Cold War and the periods of Cold War, and what was the brief timeline and the major events of the Cold War that I'm going to discuss in that heading, and what were the impacts of Cold War, and what was the world that formed after the Cold War. So let's start to discuss about these things. First of all, let's talk about the brief background of Cold War and how it was started. It is also known as the war of ideologies, the war between capitalism and the war between communism. And the roots of capitalism and communism come from two philosophers, Thomas Hobbes and Karl Marx. Thomas Hobbes gave the idea of free market economy, while Karl Marx gave its idea of communism, of socialism. So the major point was that in the Second World War, USSR lost 20 million people in the World War II, and its Western allies didn't lost that much, and it was devastated. And when the Stalin came into power, it was really determined to make the USSR and secure a great position in the future. So in 1948, USSR had left-wing governments in the countries of Eastern Europe. It was expanding at a large pace, and as its ideology was inspiring other poor or third world countries to radically change their system. So it was going and expanding at a high pace, and America feared that if the Soviet expanded at such a pace, then their domination will be the next thing in the political arena. So they feared that if they let that happen, then their power will diminish, and they won't have that much say in the system. And they also thought that it is their ideology that is also going on, that is also expanding with that expansion. So they have to stop that ideology, and that's where the Cold War started between them, the super states that were left after the World War. These were the two most powerful states left after the World War. So let's start with the introduction. What is Cold War? Well, the Cold War word came from an English writer, George Orwell, most famously known for his fictional books of 1984 and Animal Farm. He published an article in 1945 referred to what he predicted to be a nuclear stalemate between two or three monstrous superstates. So that in that article he used that word of Cold War. But what was the Cold War in reality? Cold War was the period of mistrust between two big states at that time, and it remained between 1945 and 1991 till the collapse of the Soviet Union. As I said earlier, it was also marked as the war between two dominant ideologies, battle between two dominant ideologies, democracy, capitalism versus communism and government, or the people owned government. Although both superpowers never fought a real full-fledged war, but there was a war on all the other fronts rather than the physical war between two countries. They were fighting on the space technology, who reached the space first. They were also fighting on the hold in the third world countries, and they were basically fighting in all the other fronts, in espionage and all the other kind of things. And their confrontation in the third world countries war as well. So what were the causes of Cold War? Why did Cold War occur? There were some important reasons behind that, and I have listed few of the important ones, and there can be other reasons, but I have just came across these reasons. So let's start to discuss these reasons. There were different political systems. They were against each other systems, like the capitalism promoted the competitive market, the free market economy, and while the socialism or communism promoted that there should be a central government that should control all these things. They should the central government will control the supply and the demand, while in the capitalism it was like everyone can own the property is privately owned, and everyone can have what they want to have. And US was based on the democracy and capitalism freedom, while the communism was based on dictatorship, communism, and control. USSR was based on. There was also a red scare, like the Bolshevik Revolution or the Russian Revolution that happened in the First World War. There was also a fear in the American minds that if that happened, like in the Russian Revolution, there will be no one to stop them if the red scare started to expand at that pace. Both thought their systems were better and distrusted others' intentions. They were allies in the World War II, I know, but they were also quite not well with each other in the relationship with that. Stalin despised capitalism, while Truman despised communism, and Truman also gave a Marshall Plan to stop the expand of Soviet Union, so that the Western countries that were completely destroyed after the Second World War, he devised a plan to construct the Western bloc so that they can deny the influence of Soviet Union. They were mutually exclusive kind of ideologies, and they were fighting each other. Distrust during Second World War, as we know that in the Second World War ended with the nuclear bombs on the Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The United States, in ally of the Soviet Union, USSR, in the Second World War, didn't told the Soviet Union that that the US was making nuclear weapons, and that also created a mistrust between Soviet Union and United States of America. Soviet feared the American attack. As it came to know about the nuclear weapons, it feared that if America attacks them, no one will be able to save them. The bone of contention was also on the division of Germany, as the allies France, British, and America wanted that the Germany to be united and not to be divided completely. But the Soviet Union said that Soviet Union came with its own opinion that the Germany should be divided, and the Germany was divided into two parts. As we know, that there was a Berlin Wall constructed between them, and the Germany was torn in two half parts. What was the impacts of Cold War, and how it changed the world in that period? The Cold War resulted in the formation of two parts of the world, Western and Eastern Bloc. The Western Bloc contained the US and its allies like British, France, and these states, while the Eastern Bloc contained USSR and its satellite nations that depended on the USSR for its survival. United States accused Soviet Union on seeking to expand its ideology throughout the world, as Winston Churchill gave a speech in which he talked about the Iron Curtain that was on the Eastern Europe, and it was moving towards the Central European states, and it was expanding at such a high pace. Winston Churchill said that they have to stop that Iron Curtain. Diplomatic confrontation in other parts of the world, like it was happening in North Korea and Vietnam and the Korean War. There were confrontations going on all the fronts, and proxy warfare in the third world countries. They were using other countries as the battleground rather than directly confronting each other. As I said, in Vietnam, Korean War, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, these all events are related to the Cold War, and they merge in a complete picture of Cold War as the rivalry between the two main super states. Communist bloc was held with Warsaw Pact, and it happened in the Poland, where it was basically against the NATO formation. It was against NATO, and NATO, a Northern Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was formed between US and its allies. So the Warsaw Pact was formed after NATO and against its, so that they can protect each other. So that's the map of a Cold War era, and the blue ones are basically the US and its allies, while the red one is the USSR and its satellite states, and while the other countries that are non-aligned, in which India also came as a non-aligned country, Yugoslavia, these were all the non-aligned countries at that time. They were not directly aligning with the two blocks, and they were non-aligned at that time. So that's the timeline of Cold War events. There are some major events highlighted in that timeline. I will discuss them one by one. So in 1945, as we know, was Hiroshima nuclear bomb event happened. Then in 1945, August 14, World War ended. Then the period of mistrust started. Berlin blockade began, and NATO was formed against the Soviet Union expansion. Then Berlin blockade ends. Berlin blockade was basically the Soviet Union was not directly giving access to the US allies so that they can bring supplies to the Berlin, as the Berlin was in the Soviet Union part. It was also half divided between Soviet Union and the US allies. So the Soviet Union blocked it from all the sides so that no supplies can reach there. So that was also known as the event of German blockade, and it ended in May 12, 1949. And then the Korean War begins and ends. It started in 1950, and then it went on for 3 years. Then it ended. North Korea and South Korea was formed, and the Warsaw Pact was formed against the NATO formation. Then other events of John F. Kennedy's death and Bay of Pigs. Then another major event comes in between. It is of the Cuban crisis. So the Cuban crisis was when the Soviet Union placed its nuclear weapons in the Cuba to threaten United States that if they do anything other than normal, then they will be directly bombed with a nuclear weapon. That was the time when it was like certain that the nuclear war is going to happen, but then the events cooled down, and there was a lot of diplomatic talk between the two states, and it was cancelled. Then President Kennedy was assassinated, and then after the Apollo 11 landed on the moon, then the downfall of Soviet Union really started. Like the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and then the Soviet Empire, with all its communist governments, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, fall, and the Soviet Union ends in 1991, and the Cold War ended with the end of Soviet Union. So what is the world after Cold War? The balance of power shifted drastically after the Cold War, and it was felt all over the world. Yugoslavia was divided, and there was a complete change in the arena of the world. The collapse of Soviet Union led to new states and change of governments. Like satellite states were free after the fall of USSR. Sorry. New world order emerged, and unipolarity was the new norm of the world. So that was all the holistic idea of Cold War, and that was all my lecture. So let's move on to the last resource that I am going to share with you for the map learning. There is a site known as lizardpoint.com, and it's a great site for you all to learn about the maps, and to get you a sense about where are the countries in the world. It's an interactive website, and you can learn a lot about in the website. There are a lot of exercises, quizzes in the website, and I would definitely want you to check this website out so that you can know about the geography and where the countries are, where the rivers are, main rivers, where the seas, and all about the geography and learning about them. It's a really great resource for learning about maps. So that was all. Thank you very much all. and Allah Hafiz. Take care.